Barron Trump wasn't one to follow the crowd. He was different, reserved but observant, always taking in the world around him in ways most people didn't. That November afternoon in Chicago was no exception. The crisp air carried a faint scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors and the sound of buskers playing saxophones on street corners. As Barron walked down Michigan Avenue, his long black coat flapped lightly in the breeze. He had just finished a meeting at a nearby hotel, but chose to walk instead of taking the car waiting for him. Something about the city's energy that day intrigued him, as though it had a story to tell. The sidewalks were crowded, bustling with holiday shoppers and tourists, their laughter and chatter blending into the city's soundtrack. Yet, amidst the chaos, Barron noticed something others seemed to overlook. At first, it was just a flash of movement, a hand trembling ever so slightly as it held a weathered cardboard sign. He slowed his pace, scanning the area until his gaze settled on the woman. She was sitting against the cold stone facade of a building, hunched over as if trying to fold herself into invisibility. Her clothes were thin and worn, hardly suited for the chilly weather, and her hair, streaked with grey, was tied back in a loose, messy knot. The sign in her hands read, "Veteran in need. Please help." Barron stopped in his tracks, an invisible thread tethering him to the spot. He wasn't sure what it was, perhaps her sign, perhaps the weariness in her posture, but something told him this moment was important. People moved around him like a river splitting against a rock, some glancing curiously at the tall young man who had suddenly paused mid-step. He didn't notice them. His focus was entirely on the woman. Her head was down, and she didn't seem to realize he was watching her. For a brief moment, Barron hesitated. He wasn't sure how to approach her or if she would even want him to. But the hesitation was fleeting. He wasn't the type to walk away when his gut told him to stay. He adjusted his coat and stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement. As he approached, he noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the deep lines etched into her face. She wasn't old, perhaps in her late 40s, but life had clearly been unkind to her. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice low enough not to startle her but firm enough to break through the noise around them. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to address her, much less someone who looked like Barron Trump. There was a flicker of wariness in her gaze, as though she were bracing for pity or judgment, but Barron's expression held neither. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching slightly to meet her at eye level. His height made him tower over her even in this position, but he softened the moment by offering a small, reassuring smile. She hesitated, her lips parting as if she wasn't sure whether to answer. Finally, she whispered, "Teresa. Teresa Hensley." "That's a strong name," Barron replied, his tone genuine. He could see the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, though her grip on the sign remained tight. "You're a veteran?" he asked, motioning toward the sign. Teresa nodded slowly, her expression guarded but her eyes betraying a hint of pride. 12 years in the army," she said, her voice soft and raspy from the cold. "I served overseas, got injured, and, well, things haven't been the same since." Barron listened intently, his expression shifting as he absorbed her words. He could see the weight she carried, not just the physical toll of her injury, but the emotional scars that came with it. There was a dignity in the way she spoke, even as she admitted to her struggles, and it struck him deeply. 12 years, he repeated, almost to himself. "That's a lifetime of service. You've been through more than most of us could imagine." Teresa blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. She wasn't used to people seeing her, really seeing her. Most walked by without a second glance, and those who did stop often spoke to her with condescension or pity. But this young man was different. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet determination. "What happened after your injury?" Barron asked, his voice gentle but probing. Teresa hesitated again, then sighed, her breath misting in the chilly air. "I tried to make it work," she admitted. "I had an apartment, a job, but the medical bills, the stress, it all piled up. I lost everything piece by piece," until she gestured vaguely to the space around her. "Until this." Barron felt a pang in his chest, a mix of anger and sadness. How could someone who had given so much to their country be left to fend for themselves like this? He looked at her sign again, at the simple, desperate plea for help, and made a decision. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. "Teresa," he said, his voice firmer now, "you shouldn't be out here. Let's fix that. She blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone cautious. Barron stood up straight, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Just stay here," he told her, his expression calm but resolute. "We're going to change this." As he stepped a few feet away to make the call, Teresa watched him, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope flickering in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, it felt like someone truly cared. Teresa shifted uncomfortably as Barron crouched in front of her, his presence both comforting and disarming. It had been a long time since anyone had taken the time to speak to her, let alone ask about her story. She clutched the edges of her cardboard sign tighter, as though it were a shield, a barrier between her and the rest of the world. But something in Barron's steady gaze compelled her to speak, even though the words felt heavy on her tongue. "It wasn't always like this," she began, her voice rough from the cold and lack of use. "I didn't think I'd ever end up here, you know. No wonder." She glanced down at the sidewalk, as if the cracks between the slabs held the pieces of her lost life. "I joined the army when I was 20. It wasn't just a career for me, it was a way out, a way to be part of something bigger. My family, well, they weren't much help. I wanted to prove I could do more, be more." Barron listened intently, nodding occasionally, but he didn't interrupt. He wanted to give her the space to tell her story, to unfold the layers that had led her to this moment. She shifted again, as if trying to find a comfortable position against the cold stone wall, and continued. "I was deployed twice. My first tour was tough, but the second one," she paused, her voice faltering. Her eyes seemed to glaze over as she stared at a memory only she could see. "We lost so many good people, friends, people who had families waiting for them back home. I came back with a medal, but I left pieces of myself over there." Her hands trembled slightly, and Barron noticed how she tried to steady them by folding the cardboard sign against her knees. He could see the weight of the experiences she carried, memories etched into her face like battle scars. She glanced at him, wary, as if worried she'd said too much, but his expression remained calm, encouraging. She exhaled deeply and went on. "Then there was the injury," she said, her tone quieter now, as if the words themselves hurt to say. "It wasn't even in combat, an accident during a training exercise. Just one wrong step, and everything changed. My back's never been the same. They patched me up and sent me home, but it didn't end there. The pain doesn't go away, and neither do the bills." Barron's brow furrowed slightly, and Teresa noticed. "Yeah," she said with a faint, bitter laugh. "They don't tell you that part, do they? They don't tell you how hard it is to pick up the pieces when your body doesn't work like it used to, when the nightmares come every night, and when the people you thought would have your back suddenly don't." She swallowed hard, blinking quickly as though trying to fight back tears. "I tried to make it work. I got a job as a dispatcher, nothing fancy, but it paid the rent. Then the medical bills started stacking up. My landlord didn't care that I served my country. He just cared about his money. 1 month I fell short, then 2. Before I knew it, I was out on the street with nothing but a duffel bag and this stupid sign." Her voice broke on the last word, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed by the emotion creeping into her tone. Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "It's not stupid," he said. "None of this is your fault." Teresa shook her head, a faint, humorless smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "That's nice of you to say, but it doesn't change anything, does it? People see me sitting here, and all they see is someone who gave up, someone who's broken. They don't care about the 12 years I gave or the sacrifices I made. They just see this." She motioned to herself, to her worn clothes and trembling hands. Barron's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way she spoke about herself, as though she were apologizing for existing. He could tell she wasn't looking for pity, she just wanted someone to hear her, to understand. He wasn't sure what he could say to take away her pain, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let her story end here. Barron stood silently for a moment after Teresa finished her story, his mind racing. Her words lingered, each one painting a vivid picture of hardship and resilience. He felt a knot tighten in his chest, a mixture of frustration at the system that had failed her and determination to do something about it. The cold wind picked up, biting at his face, but he barely noticed. He glanced at Teresa again. She was looking at him with a mix of curiosity and caution, as if bracing herself for him to walk away like so many others before him. But Barron wasn't going anywhere. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his phone. "Stay right here," he said, his voice steady but commanding. "We're going to figure this out." Teresa blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. She wasn't used to promises like this, promises that were actually kept. Barron stepped a few feet away, his phone already pressed to his ear, dialing a number from memory. "Margaret," he said, as soon as the line connected. His tone was calm but urgent. "I need you to find the nearest hotel with available rooms. Something decent, and I need it now." There was a pause as his assistant responded. "Yes, also get a doctor, someone who can come on short notice. This is important." Another pause. "Thank you, call me back as soon as you have it." Teresa watched him from her spot on the ground, her hands still gripping the edges of her cardboard sign. She didn't know what to make of the scene unfolding in front of her. The young man who had stopped to talk to her was now pacing the sidewalk, issuing instructions into his phone like someone who was used to getting things done. There was a sense of urgency in his movements, but not the kind that made her feel rushed. Instead, it felt deliberate, as though he had decided that her situation wasn't something to be ignored for even a second longer. When Barron ended the call, he turned back to Teresa and crouched down again, meeting her gaze. "Help is on the way," he said simply. The certainty in his voice was almost unsettling, but there was also a warmth there that made her believe him. Before she could say anything, he stood up and scanned the area. His eyes landed on a nearby food vendor, a small cart with steam rising from metal trays. Without a word, he walked over, pulling out his wallet. The vendor greeted him with a surprised smile, clearly recognizing him, but Barron waved off any pleasantries. "I need a bowl of soup," he said, glancing over the menu, "and a sandwich. Something warm." A few minutes later, he returned to Teresa with the steaming food in hand. He knelt beside her and placed the items on the ground within her reach. "Here," he said, his voice softening. "Eat this. You need something in your system." Teresa hesitated, her fingers hovering over the bowl of soup. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice almost inaudible. "You don't even know me." Barron paused, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Because someone should have done it already," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And if no one else will, then I will." She stared at him for a long moment before finally picking up the soup and taking a small sip. The warmth spread through her body, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than despair. Barron didn't press her to talk while she ate. Instead, he sat beside her, his phone in hand, checking for updates from Margaret. It wasn't long before his phone buzzed. He stood up, answered quickly, and nodded as Margaret spoke. "Perfect," he said into the receiver. "Make sure the staff is ready when we get there. I'll handle the rest." He ended the call and turned back to Teresa, who was watching him with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "There's a car coming to pick us up," he told her. "We're going to get you somewhere warm and safe tonight." Teresa looked down at the now empty bowl of soup in her lap, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to say no, to refuse the help she'd spent so long believing she didn't deserve. But something in Barron's tone told her that this wasn't charity, it was a genuine offer, one that came without strings or expectations. When the sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, Barron opened the door and extended a hand toward her. She hesitated, her eyes darting between his face and the car. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice steadier this time but still laced with disbelief. Barron met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Because I can," he said simply, "and because you deserve it." This time she didn't argue. She reached for his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. The moment felt heavier than it should have, as though it wasn't just a physical act, but the start of something more, something she couldn't quite name yet. As they climbed into the car and the door shut behind them, Teresa glanced at Barron once more, still trying to make sense of the young man who had stopped on the street and decided to change her life. The CUV moved smoothly through the crowded streets of Chicago, the hum of the engine barely audible over the muffled chatter of pedestrians outside. Teresa sat in silence, clutching the edge of her seat, her fingers gripping the fabric, as if the world might pull her back to the cold pavement at any moment. She glanced sideways at Barron, who sat beside her with his phone in hand, typing rapidly. His focus was unwavering, his face calm but resolute, as though he was solving a puzzle he'd been handed moments before. She had never been in a car like this, its leather seats and polished interior making her feel almost out of place. It was warm, though so much warmer than the sidewalk, and for the first time in months, her shivering had stopped. The vehicle came to a stop outside a towering hotel, its facade shimmering under the golden glow of evening lights. Teresa's eyes widened as she took in the grandeur of the entrance, revolving glass doors, uniformed doormen, and a lobby that seemed to gleam even from the street. This can't be for me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Barron glanced at her, his expression softening for the first time since they'd met. "It is," he said simply. "Let's get you inside." The driver stepped out and opened the door for them. Barron exited first, extending a hand toward Teresa. She hesitated, her instincts telling her this couldn't be real. But his unwavering gaze told her otherwise. With a deep breath, she placed her trembling hand in his and stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of every stare from the hotel staff. To her surprise, their smiles were warm, their greetings genuine. It was as though they'd been expecting her. Margaret, Barron's assistant, appeared in the lobby, her phone pressed to her ear as she orchestrated the next steps. Spotting Barron, she ended her call and approached swiftly. "The suite is ready," she said, glancing at Teresa with a kind smile. "The doctor will arrive in 20 minutes." Barron nodded in approval. "Perfect. Let's make sure she's comfortable first." Teresa followed them into an elevator that felt more like a glass capsule, offering a view of the bustling city as it rose smoothly to the top floors. Her heart raced. She hadn't been indoors like this, safe, warm, surrounded by walls that didn't seem to cave in on her in years. When the elevator doors opened, she found herself stepping into a hallway lined with plush carpets and elegant light fixtures. Margaret led them to a door, sliding a keycard through the lock. The door clicked open, revealing a suite that took Teresa's breath away. The space was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. A large bed, draped in crisp white linens, sat in the center of the room, and a sitting area with a velvet couch and armchairs invited her to rest. A steaming cup of tea sat on the coffee table, as if waiting for her arrival. Teresa stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of whether she could step inside. "Go ahead," Barron said gently, motioning toward the room. "This is for you." His tone was calm, but there was something in his expression that told her he wouldn't accept her refusal. With tentative steps, Teresa moved inside, her fingers grazing the back of the couch as though to confirm it was real. The warmth of the room enveloped her, and she felt her knees threaten to give way. Barron was at her side in an instant, steadying her. "Take it slow," he said. "You've been through a lot." Moments later, a knock at the door announced the arrival of the doctor. A middle-aged woman with a kind face entered, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Margaret introduced her as Dr. Ellis, who immediately got to work, checking Teresa's vitals, examining her injuries, and asking questions about her health. Teresa answered hesitantly at first, but soon found herself opening up, the doctor's calm demeanor putting her at ease. Barron remained nearby, watching quietly, ensuring everything was handled with care. As the doctor finished, she handed Teresa a small bag of medications and a list of recommendations. "You'll need to take it easy for a while," Dr. Ellis said with a smile. "But you're stronger than you think. You'll get through this." Teresa nodded, her throat tight with emotion. It wasn't just the words, it was the fact that someone had taken the time to care. After the doctor left, Margaret reappeared with a folder in hand. "We've contacted Veterans United," she said, directing her words to Barron but glancing at Teresa. "They'll be here within the hour to discuss housing and support options." Barron nodded, then turned to Teresa. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's a plan in place now. You're not alone anymore." Teresa stared at him, her hands clasped tightly together, as if holding herself together. "I don't understand why you're doing all of this," she whispered. Barron crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze directly. "Because you deserve it," he said simply. "You gave so much of yourself, and it's time someone gave back." Tears welled in her eyes. But this time she didn't look away. For the first time in years, she felt like her story wasn't just one of survival, it was the start of something new. As the evening deepened, Teresa sat on the edge of the bed in the hotel suite, staring out the vast floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. The skyline shimmered like a sea of stars, vibrant and alive, a sharp contrast to the quiet battles she had fought within herself for years. The room was warm and inviting, but Teresa couldn't shake the weight of disbelief. It was hard to reconcile the reality of where she was with where she had been just hours earlier, shivering on the cold pavement, invisible to the world. The sound of voices in the hallway snapped her out of her thoughts. A moment later, Barron entered the suite, followed by a woman with a confident stride and a warm smile. The woman looked to be in her early 40s, dressed in professional yet approachable attire, with a folder tucked under her arm. Teresa, Barron said, his tone calm yet encouraging. "This is Lisa from Veterans United. She's here to help." Lisa stepped forward and extended her hand. "Hi, Teresa. It's a pleasure to meet you," she said, her voice steady and kind. Teresa hesitated before shaking her hand, her grip tentative. She wasn't sure what to say. She had heard of organizations like Veterans United before, but had never imagined one stepping into her life. Lisa sat down across from her at the small table in the suite's sitting area and opened her folder. She glanced briefly at Barron, who nodded, then turned her full attention to Teresa. "I know this might feel overwhelming," Lisa began, her tone gentle but professional. "But I want you to know that we're here to support you every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Teresa leaned back slightly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. What does that mean?" she asked, her voice wary. Years of surviving on her own had taught her to approach offers of help with caution. Too often, promises came with strings attached, or worse, they vanished altogether. Lisa's smile didn't waver. "It means we're going to start by finding you stable housing," she said. "We have partnerships with several programs that specialize in helping veterans like you get back on their feet. Temporary housing, job training, mental health resources, you name it. Whatever you need to rebuild, we're going to help you find it." Teresa's brow furrowed as she processed the words. Stable housing, job training, mental health support. These were things she had dreamed of but had stopped believing were possible for her. "And you can really do all of that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa nodded. "We can, and we will. But the most important thing is that you take it one step at a time. Tonight, you're safe here. Tomorrow, we'll start making calls and getting everything in motion. We'll take care of the logistics. You just need to focus on taking care of yourself." Barron watched the exchange silently, standing by the window with his arms crossed. He had seen people in powerful positions make grand speeches about helping veterans, but few had followed through. Lisa's matter-of-fact approach reassured him. She wasn't here for appearances, she was here to make a real difference. As Lisa continued outlining the plan, Teresa began to ask more questions. Her initial hesitation melted into cautious curiosity. "What kind of jobs?" she asked. "How long does it take to get housing?" For every question, Lisa had a clear, confident answer. It wasn't just talk. She spoke as someone who had helped dozens of veterans before, someone who understood the struggles and knew how to navigate them. When the conversation shifted to mental health, Teresa's voice grew quieter again. I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Lisa leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "That's okay," she said. "Healing takes time. No one's going to force you to do anything you're not ready for. But when you are, we'll be here." Teresa nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. For the first time in years, she felt like someone truly understood, not just the surface-level struggles, but the deeper, harder-to-explain ones, the ones that came from years of feeling like a burden. As Lisa wrapped up the discussion, she handed Teresa a card with her contact information. "If you ever need anything at all, you call me," she said. "You're not alone in this anymore." After Lisa left, Teresa sat quietly for a long moment, turning the card over in her hands. "She seems real," she said finally, her voice tentative. Barron, still standing by the window, turned to face her. "She is," he said simply. "And so is this opportunity." Teresa looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for any of this." Barron walked over and placed a hand on the back of the chair she was sitting in. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just focus on moving forward. The rest will take care of itself." For the first time in years, Teresa allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it would. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows of the hotel suite, casting a warm glow over the room. Teresa stirred in the bed, waking to the soft hum of the city below. For a moment, she lay still, unsure of where she was. The plush mattress beneath her, the gentle weight of the duvet, and the faint scent of lavender from the night before, it all felt foreign, Like a dream, she wasn't ready to leave. Slowly, she opened her eyes, and reality began to take shape. This wasn't the cold pavement. This wasn't another restless night in the shadows. She was here, in a place she never thought she'd see, let alone call her own for even a moment. Her feet touched the carpeted floor, and she sat at the edge of the bed, gazing out at the city skyline. The world outside felt alive in a way she hadn't noticed in years. There was no immediate rush to move, no pressure to find her next meal or a safe corner to rest. For the first time, she felt still. But stillness didn't come without its own challenges. The weight of what had brought her here lingered in her chest, mingling with an unfamiliar sensation hope. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Teresa hesitated before standing, her body still aching but steadier than it had been in weeks. She opened the door to find Barron standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning," he said, offering her one. His expression was calm but watchful, as though gauging how she was doing without having to ask outright. Teresa took the cup, the warmth of it grounding her in the present. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Lisa called," Barron said, stepping inside and taking a seat in one of the armchairs. "Veterans United has found a temporary housing option for you. It's not far from here. You'll have your own space, access to resources, and a caseworker to help you transition. They're ready whenever you are." Teresa sat across from him, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup. The idea of having her own space again felt surreal, almost too much to hope for. And, after that, she asked tentatively, "What happens when the temporary part runs out?" Barron leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The temporary part is just the start," he said. "They'll work with you to find something permanent, whether it's housing, a job, or anything else you need to build a stable future. But the first step is getting you settled." She nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. A stable future. It sounded like a phrase from another lifetime, something she'd stopped believing in when the nights on the street stretched into months. "It feels strange," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "to think about the future, to even imagine one." Barron didn't rush to respond. Instead, he let her words linger in the air before speaking. "It's not strange," he said. "It's new. And new things take time to get used to. But you've made it through worse. You'll find your footing." His words weren't overly sentimental, but they carried a weight that made her believe them. She looked down at the coffee in her hands, the steam curling into the air, and allowed herself to entertain the possibility that he might be right. By mid-morning, Lisa arrived to take Teresa to her new housing. The goodbye at the hotel was simple but heartfelt. "If you need anything," Barron said, as they stood near the elevator, "don't hesitate to reach out. This isn't the end of the road, it's just the beginning." Teresa nodded, struggling to find the right words. Finally, she said, "Thank you for everything. You've given me a chance I didn't think I'd ever have again." "You don't owe me thanks," Barron replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "Just make the most of it, and when you can, pay it forward." As the elevator doors closed, Teresa felt a pang of fear mixed with determination. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was hers to take. When Lisa led her into the small apartment that would serve as her temporary home, Teresa's first instinct was to stand in the doorway, taking in every detail: the simple furniture, the clean walls, the soft hum of the heater. It wasn't much, but to her, it felt like a palace. She set her small bag on the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. It no longer felt like a cold, unfeeling place. It felt alive with possibility. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, Teresa allowed herself to imagine a future for the first time in years. It wasn't a grand vision, just small steps: finding a job, building a routine, reconnecting with the pieces of herself she thought she'd lost. The path wouldn't be easy, but it was hers. And for the first time, that was enough.